Hey, welcome back, everyone. All right, so I'm sure you all saw the news. Derek Chauvin, the officer who is now accused, or now I guess found guilty, of killing, um, of killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck, has been found guilty by a jury. So we'll be talking about this and also a bit of what's been happening behind the scenes, because while the jury was being doxxed by the media, you had public officials actually meeting with the protesters, telling them to get more confrontational. Statements which were taken, at least argued in court, should have been grounds to dismiss the whole case because, again, it was taken as threats against the jury. You had a severed pig's head put in front of the home of what people believed was one of the witnesses. One of the people came in to testify, although it appears the people who left the severed head of the pig left it in the wrong place. And so what you have essentially is a jury coming to a conclusion amidst multiple threats against them, multiple threats against other individuals tied to the case, and really a very political issue decided by a jury, again, based on their assessment of the information provided to them, and very likely information provided to them that is not necessarily real, because of the way the media has been behaving, although, of course, they heard testimony from different individuals who've also been indoctrinated by some true stories, some misinformation, but a whole lot of politicization of this issue going back until last year. So, folks, good to all see you here. I'll be going a bit more into this. Of course, the judge has not made the final ruling yet, and so we're still waiting on that. But currently, the jury has agreed to convict Derek Chauvin on all charges. And so I'll be explaining this, also going into some other stories of what's happening across the country right now. Trump making some statements about 2022 and 2024. A lot to go into tonight, folks. And so that said, as always, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Tonight's drink, by the way, is a nice Taiwanese mountain tea. And folks, it's good to all see you here. Yeah, Cassie Hansen, good to see you as well. Yeah, the lone wolf, he said George Floyd killed George Floyd. Actually accurate if you look at the evidence that was presented, that really he died of a drug overdose. And the officer who knelt on his neck was doing so using a method actually outlined in the use of force doctrine within the police jurisdiction he was in. In other words, what he was doing, kneeling on George Floyd's neck, and actually if you look at the photos, it was more like his shoulder. It wasn't actually on his neck itself, just depending on the angle of the video you look at, is actually within the use of force doctrine. And so Derek Chauvin was using normal use of force approved. In fact, even in the manuals of the police department he was in, on a man who was dying of a drug overdose. But of course, he's now been convicted on all three charges because this is really a political issue, right? Let's go into what happened, folks, and then we'll go into a few questions. All right, so first article here, Epoch Times reports, Derek Chauvin found guilty on all charges in death of George Floyd. And it says here, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on April 20th was convicted of all three charges in the death of George Floyd. Jurors decided to convict Chauvin of second-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, and third-degree murder. Right? He's guilty of 2 murders and a manslaughter when he killed one person, but let's go into it a bit more. Chauvin faces up to 75 years in prison. He declined to testify in the trial. Jurors spent approximately 8 hours, 20 minutes deliberating across 2 days. And the article continues a bit further down, stating, Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner, concluded that Floyd's death was a homicide as a result of pulmonary arrest in the context of law enforcement. And he says the fentanyl and methamphetamines, fentanyl and meth, detected in Floyd's body in the autopsy, in addition to his health history, contributed to the death, the medical examiner's office found. And of course, he had fatal levels of fentanyl in his system, and typically fatal levels of fentanyl or any other drug will typically lead to fatal results, we would assume. And of course, he was saying that he couldn't breathe. Normally, if your air passageway is blocked, you actually can't speak, which is usually something that informs officers if the person actually can't breathe. But little did he know that George Floyd was dying of a drug overdose as he was pinned to the ground for, believe 9 minutes and a bit over. Now, it goes on saying the fentanyl and methamphetamines, again, contributed to this. And Baker also told the court, quote, "It was the stress of that interaction that tipped him over the edge, given his underlying health disease and his toxicological status." In other words, he believes it was the officer stressed him out, right? The officer didn't kill him by kneeling on his neck. The officer killed him by stressing him out, which triggered his underlying health illnesses, including COVID-19, his drug overdose of fentanyl, and also the methamphetamines in his system. And so, the officer shouldn't have stressed him out so much, apparently, and now he's guilty of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. Let's go a bit more into this. Afterwards, what happened? Epoch Times reports this: Biden calls George Floyd's family after Chauvin verdict. It says here, President Joe Biden phoned family members of George Floyd after a jury found former police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of all 3 charges in Floyd's death. And Biden said this: "We are all so relieved, not just on one verdict, but all 3. Or not just one verdict, but all 3. Guilty on all 3 counts. It's really important." And he continued saying, "I'm anxious to see you guys. We're going to get a lot more done. We're going to do a lot. We're going to stay at it until we get it done." What are they going to stay at? What are they going to get a lot more done? What does it have to do with the conviction of a police officer, again, a man who was dying of a drug overdose, being charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter? What does it have to do with getting something done? What is he saying? We're going to stay at it until we get done. This is, of course, suggesting that the death of George Floyd and the prosecution of this police officer, right, Derek Chauvin, is part of some broader agenda, right? Part of something else. Biden saying we're going to stay at it until we get it done, right? He's already been convicted. What else is going to get done? And he says we're going to get a lot more done. We're going to do a lot. Now, again, this ties into the issue that this is a political case, right? Derek Chauvin is now really the first political prisoner of the, let's say, woke revolution now taking place in America, right? Derek Chauvin is going to be very likely a political prisoner because this is a political case, charges of which were, again, based on an individual dying of drug overdose and, again, of underlying health issues. And, again, the stress allegedly is what killed him. Stress caused by the officer who was arresting him. Again, he was resisting arrest and so on, right? This is what's been happening. Now, one more point on this. Biden also said beforehand, while the jury was still meeting on this, right? Biden said that he was praying for the right verdict in the trial. And Epoch Times also reported another story. President Joe Biden on Tuesday said that he hopes jurors in Derek Chauvin's trial reach the, quote, right verdict. How would Biden describe the right verdict? And he said, I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think it's overwhelming in my view. I would say that unless the jury was sequestered now, not hearing me say that. He said, I wouldn't say that unless the jury was sequestered now, hearing me say that. And so he's again suggesting that the jury was not having access to cell phones or anything like that. They were meeting and deliberating on the charges. And he said he wouldn't have said that were that not the case, meaning he believes he was not interfering with their decision by saying that. Now, folks, I want to go into a bit of the threats that were taking place in this because, again, I had Maxine Waters, as you can see here, really criticized for allegedly making threats. And she was encouraging the protesters to be more confrontational in the context of already carrying out rioting, already carrying out looting, already having murdered people last year. How do you get more confrontational than rioting, burning, looting, and murdering? Well, you tell me. She was telling them to be more confrontational. What does that refer to? We're also going to go into some of the other threats that were taking place against individuals tied to this case. Now, before we go more into it, though, of course, Crossroads is totally demonetized by YouTube. And folks, I mentioned before, we have a new platform, Epoch TV, which you can find on the Epoch Times website, TheEpochTimes.com. But folks, we also have supporters. And tonight's sponsor is American Hartford Gold. And with all the turbulence in the economy, the stock market, and with risks of inflation, multi-trillion-dollar spending bills, China launching a new digital currency to wage a currency war against America, well, folks, there's one asset that typically tends to be relatively stable and usually on the incline. That's gold and silver. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, please check out the link in the comments below where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. And again, even if you're not looking to invest at this time, you just want to learn about the benefits of investing in gold or silver or how to do it, check out the information guide they've given us. And if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver in all qualifying first orders. The number is 877-260-2764, or you can text Joshua to 65532. Now, folks, let's go a bit more into what's happening. And Viridian G, you mentioned BLM, still riots either way. Very likely we're going to see riots either way. So get ready for the riots, which they've already been announcing. Let's go into a bit of what's happening on the threats against the jury, the threats against witnesses, and what else has been happening right now. And then after that, we'll go into some questions and then quite a bit else to talk about, talking about what Trump's doing right now, talking about Mike Lindell's new social media and the attacks that have been taking place against it. Also, a few other stories, folks, so stick around. But first of all, let's talk about what's happening with Maxine Waters. Epoch Times reports this. House votes down resolution condemning Maxine Waters' remarks on Chauvin trial. And this is before he was, of course, found guilty by the jury. It says the House of Representatives on Tuesday voted down a resolution that would have censored Representative Maxine Waters, a Democrat from California. The party line vote, right? They voted along party lines, saw 216 Democrats reject the resolution and 210 Republicans back it. 2 members from each party did not vote. Waters traveled to a Minneapolis suburb over the weekend and urged demonstrators to be, quote, more confrontational if former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was not convicted on charges in the death of George Floyd. In other words, if he was not convicted, right, if he was found guilty, in other words, if a court of law determined that he was innocent, she was calling on people to riot, to be more confrontational, quote, more confrontational, right? In other words, if law was served, if justice was served, she was calling on them to do more essentially than what they were doing before. And what they were doing before was, again, to go back to the early riots, burning, looting, murdering, right? How do you get more confrontational than that? What does that refer to? Now, on this is what she said. She said, we're looking for a guilty verdict. They're looking for a guilty verdict. This is a politician speaking. She said, we're looking for a guilty verdict. And the proposed resolution filed by House Minority Leader against her, right? House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, included most of Waters' remarks. It also referenced how Hennepin County Judge Peter Cahill recommended on them in the courtroom, saying in part, quote, this is the judge who said this, I wish elected officials to stop talking about this case, especially in a matter that is disrespectful to the court of law and to the judicial branch of our function. He was saying that he was wishing that public officials would not comment on the decisions being made in a court of law, in other words. Now, McCarthy urged that Waters, quote, broke the law by violating curfew and then incited violence. And again, she did both, essentially. If we look at what the context of being more confrontational would mean based on the previous actions of these individuals. And even the judge did suggest that she maybe stepped over the line. Of course, we'll have to see what the judge does because the verdict from the judge is still not announced. And it's possible the judge may take this into consideration. We'll have to see what happens with it. Now, a bit more on what the judge said. Epoch Times also reports another story here. It says, judge criticizes Representative Maxine Waters for confrontational remarks during Chauvin trial. And it says here, Hennepin County District Judge Peter Cahill on Monday responded to a comment made by Chauvin defense attorney Eric Nelson, who noted that over the weekend, a, quote, United States congressperson was making what I interpreted to be, and he continues, threats against the sanctity of the jury process. And he also said it, quote, was threatening and intimidating the jury. He was saying, this is again a lawyer, saying that Maxine Waters was threatening and intimidating the jury in her statements. Again, saying that if the jury, right, if the jury were to conclude that he was innocent, if this Derek Chauvin, the officer, was innocent, that they should go out and riot on the streets. And keep in mind, folks, that the media have been writing quote unquote biographies of the jurors. In other words, media was doxing the jurors, meaning that the jurors themselves might not have been safe. Pretty serious times, right? And going a bit more into this, right? Again, the judge said, I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in matters disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch of our branch and our function, right? And that was in response to what the lawyer said. So he seemed to agree to an extent with the lawyer. Gray Clouds, you're asking what his sentence is. The sentence has not yet been announced. The judge is still going to come out with that. We're still waiting on that. Chauvin does face 75 years in prison. But really, again, because this does seem to be a politicized case, right? This is a political trial. He's a political prisoner if he goes to jail. We can expect that if a Republican comes into office, it's very possible that he might be dismissed. He might be, what do you call it? He might be pardoned. I would put the chance of that very high if a Republican comes into office, because again, this is a political, right? This is a political case. Now, going a bit more into this, Cahill said in response to Nelson's statements, noting that he was aware, this is the judge saying he was aware, Waters was talking specifically about this trial and the unacceptability of, quote, anything less than a murder conviction. So the judge was aware that Maxine Waters was speaking specifically about this trial and demanding a murder conviction. And he says if they want to give their options, they should do so in a manner that is consistent with their oath to the Constitution. He's suggesting that Maxine Waters may have violated her oath to the Constitution in saying that, although not saying it directly, right? He was suggesting it. And this came as the lawyer Nelson argued that Waters' comments should have prejudiciated the jury, right? Committed perjury against the jury, and could be grounds to declare a mistrial. Now, we'll have to see what the judge does. Maybe the judge will declare a mistrial. It doesn't seem that's the case at this time. We'll have to see what ends up happening. A bit more on this, though, just emphasizing the political nature of all this, Pelosi chimed in, saying that Waters should not apologize for comments on the Chauvin trial. Now, right, Nancy Pelosi saying that Maxine Waters should not even apologize for her statements. Again, the president's weighing in. You have political leaders weighing in. Even the judge concerned about political leaders overstepping their constitutional oaths and making these statements. Lawyers concerned that this may have led to threats against the jury based on the nature of the statements, calling again for riots, essentially. Right? If it is more confrontational than riots that were already taking place, how do you get more confrontational than riots? Including, again, riots that led to burning, murder, arson, right? Burning, murder, looting, you name it. How do you get more confrontational? Maybe attacking jurors? That would be the concern of the lawyer, right? This was a threat against the jurors themselves. Now, a bit more on this as well. Let's go into it. Epoch Times also reports vandals leave severed pig's head at former home of defense witness in Chauvin trial. Now, they left this in front of the wrong house, just emphasizing the types of individuals we're dealing with. They left it in front of the wrong house, but again, being interpreted as a threat against the witness, right? Let's go a bit more into this. It says here, police officers over the weekend found a severed pig's head and blood splashed on and around a doorway of a home in California, formerly occupied by an expert who testified for the defense in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Again, who knows what they really meant by it, but again, people often call police pigs. We don't like police, and maybe having a severed pig's head with blood splattered meant that they were going to kill a pig or something, right? This could be the meaning of it. Who knows what they really intended by it? Just guessing. Typically, right? This is like Godfather type stuff, like leaving a severed horse head in the guy's bed, right? They left a severed pig's head in front of this guy's house, although again, they got the wrong house. Let's go into it. On April 17th, a group of vandals dumped, this is before, of course, the jury came up with everything, right? On April 17th, a group of vandals dumped the pig's head in front of and splattered blood on the house of West Santa Rosa. In West Santa Rosa, the city's police department stated, photographs disseminated by authorities showed blood smeared across the home's garage doors and splattered on and around its front door. Officers arrived, it says, to find the front of the victim's house smeared with what appeared to be animal blood and a decapitated pig's head near the front porch, the Santa Rosa Police Department said in a statement. The home was once, in other words, they got the wrong house. It used to be the residence of Barry Broad, a retired police officer who was called by the defense in Chauvin's trial and the death of George Floyd. Now, what normally happens if witnesses are being threatened, if it's a case like this, what normally happens if people are threatening witnesses in ways that are as public as this, in ways that could, again, lead to a mistrial because the jury, right, is supposed to remain unbiased. This is one of the issues you have in a politicized trial, right? This is what usually happens. Now, what happened, I'm sure some of you served jury duty, or at the very least sat in court while the judge asks the jurors different questions to see if they're fit to serve, right? To see if they're fit to stand on a jury. And typically, here's how it goes. They ask them, especially in politicized cases, right? Highly political, highly covered cases, things that are in the news cycle. They will ask them, have you been following the story? What are your feelings about it? What are your thoughts about it? And they'll ask the jury to not read the news, to not follow the story, out of concern, again, that even seeing stories about what's happening are going to lead them to, say, change their decision on what it is. Now, the mainstream media has been repeating really pretty extreme statements, right? The mainstream media has essentially been saying, guilty as charged. They've been reporting only one side of all the cases. They haven't been showing, for example, the evidence showing that Derek Chauvin was very likely innocent, that he did not intend to kill George Floyd, right? Unintentional, one. Two, that he didn't know George Floyd had overdosed on drugs and was dying of a drug overdose. And three, right, wasn't doing something that would normally kill someone. Again, even the coroner's report showed that it wasn't the actual kneeling on his neck that killed him, right? He says that it was the stress from this that caused the other things to react. Again, his underlying health problems, the fatal level of fentanyl in his system, which being fatal might have killed him. And of course, the methamphetamine in his system and the combination of drugs, underlying health issue, and stress led to his death, while the officer he was not aware of these issues. Again, he was dealing with someone who was being erratic, dealing with someone who was resisting arrest, and of course, maybe it wasn't his best judgment to kneel on his neck for as long as he did, which may have been a bit excessive. But again, even within the manuals for the police, approved use of force, that was actually in the manuals, meaning he did not even step outside approved use of force within his jurisdiction. But again, politicized case, and many of the jurors very likely weren't being shown the full context of all this information if they were reading any mainstream news outlet, because most of the mainstream news outlets were not showing this context. Now, going a bit further into this, right? On another note, Minnesota governor promises not to let buildings burn in potential riots. In other words, even if the jurors were not following the news cycle, very likely they were hearing there were going to be potential riots. They very likely knew that their names were released by the media, or at the very least, there were information provided by the media about the jurors. And jurors may have felt threatened and felt like they might be targeted by these individuals, threatening riots, encouraged by public officials, being lied about by the media, and being doxxed to an extent by the media. Maybe again that there was threat of burning, threat of riots, threat of violence. Even again, severed pig's head left in front of the home of a witness, or former home of a witness. Maybe this led to their feelings about the case, right? Which in some cases may lead a judge to conclude that they can't convict it because the jurors were being threatened to an extent, which they were to an extent, right? And again, witnesses were being threatened and public officials are making threatening comments. Now, a bit more on this. Minnesota's governor is preparing for potential unrest after the verdict is announced. This is previous to the final verdict. And Derek Chauvin's trial, with the memory of rioting in the summer last year following George Floyd's death still fresh in many minds. And again, which jurors may not have been familiar with the riots that took place last year? Which jurors may not have been reading just the mainstream news articles, which were presenting a lot of false information? And which jurors may have been or may not have been influenced by the fake news reporting? There was a lot of it last year. Not to mention, again, the deep politicizing of this case. Now, on another note of this, Facebook is to remove some posts about George Floyd ahead of the verdict. So before this verdict came out, Facebook was saying it was going to delete some posts, and here's why. Epoch Times reports this another story. It says Facebook is preparing for the verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin by removing some posts about George Floyd and deleting missives calling for arms to be brought to areas in Minneapolis. In other words, people were calling for weapons, firearms, arms to be brought to some areas, as you had public officials calling on people to be more controversial, right? And right, Peter Conway, the jury found him guilty, not the judge. Thank you for correcting that. I thought we did say that, but maybe I'm wrong. So again, we're still waiting. We're still waiting on the judge. And we'll have to see, right? If the judge is saying Maxine Waters' comments could overturn the conviction, that will be very big. At the very least, folks, we're still anticipating riots, maybe either way. Now, on this as well, right? Epoch Times continues on this story. Chauvin is the former Minneapolis police officer accused of killing George Floyd in the city in March of last year. And on this, it says Facebook teams are working around the clock to monitor potential threats both on and off the platform and Instagram, which it also owns, so we can protect peaceful protests and limit content that could lead to civil unrest or violence, according to Monica Bickert, its vice president of content policy, saying in a blog post. I'll have to see what happens with this, right? And folks, also on this, an important story, as you have risks of violence, as you have threats, again, doxing of the jury, as you have threats against the entire community, people saying they're going to riot, really what could amount in some cases to even terror threats if they're threatening to burn, to loot, and to murder. And again, threatening to bring in firearms, waiting for all this to happen, to the extent that even local officials are commenting on the need for additional security. And Facebook is even limiting posts calling for people to bring weapons to the scene to, again, act out in violence based on what's happening. What's happening in Washington? As again, political officials are making statements really encouraging this type of action. As Biden himself, for example, is calling the family and saying this is just the beginning, right? Just saying they're going to keep moving with this. What are these public officials doing? Well, folks, they're protecting themselves. They're surrounding themselves with more guards. And Epoch Times reports this. D.C. National Guard approves deployment of 250 troops ahead of verdict in Chauvin trial. In other words, our politicians, as they're encouraging this, are putting additional troops on the ground, people with firearms, to protect them from the American people who they're also encouraging in their actions as we speak. Now, let's explain this one, then we'll go into some questions, folks. It says here, Epoch Times reports, the D.C. National Guard on Monday approved the deployment of 250 troops requested by the city ahead of the verdict in the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin, who faces second-degree murder charges and other charges in the May 2020 death of George Floyd. City officials initially, however, had requested as many as 1,000 troops ahead of the verdict as city leaders anticipated potential civil unrest, according to the Associated Press. Now, folks, what are we saying here? Essentially, it's mob rule. We'll have to see what the judge does, right? The jury ruled, right? The jury made their decision based on the evidence presented to them, possibly based on threats against them, possibly based on impressions they had of this case going back to last year, and possibly because of fears for their own safety, given the fact that, again, threats were being made against them. People were pretty adamant about it. Their information was being released online by the media. Public officials were encouraging the protesters to really lash out in more riots, essentially, if they did anything other than say he's guilty. In other words, if they didn't say that he's guilty, they were themselves facing these riots, possibly sweeping their cities already, right? The judge, we're still waiting for the verdict from the judge. What are we seeing here, folks? It's essentially mob rule. And, this isn't something new. This is something going back to even the way that democracies, say, constitutional republics in history typically lead to democracy or mob rule, right? This is your great Athenian democratic system as opposed to the Roman Republican system that we're watching here. And what is the difference? America is a constitutional republic. And what does that mean? We have written laws, right, that protect us as citizens, that guard our rights, right? The Constitution of the United States lays out our natural rights, right to bear arms, right to free speech, right to worship, so on. But it also lays out many legal protections for us. What you have at work are people saying they no longer want the Constitution to essentially act as this. They're talking about the Constitution as a living document. From the very get-go, the very idea, in fact, of democracy as opposed to a constitutional republic, if you go back to the times of George Washington, he referred to democracy as a system of mob rule, right? The democrat societies, which he was concerned about and which he referred to as being possibly, he believed, behind the Whiskey Rebellion, right, going to soon after the American Revolution. Right, talking about all these things. What you had essentially was concern about mob rule. And what's the difference? It means that pretty much rather than saying we have a system of law to deal with issues, that issues should be taken in front of, again, a judge and a jury and should be deemed true or false based on the evidence provided. And the jury should not be contaminated in their opinion based on information they're being exposed to outside of what's presented to them as evidence, right? Really what we're seeing is an issue that's been politicized. In other words, you had officials saying guilty or not guilty, essentially. We want him to be guilty. Guilty or not guilty. They wanted, Maxine Waters at least, guilty or not guilty. Unless they got what they wanted protests. Guilty or not guilty. He is guilty by the mob, right? That was essentially what public officials were stating, even when Biden himself was saying that he hopes they make the right decision. What is the right decision, right? Is that to say, based on the evidence, I believe that, again, Derek Chauvin is innocent based on the evidence presented, and the evidence is pretty heavy, honestly, that he did not do it intentionally, that, again, George Floyd had fatal levels of drugs in his system. And even again, according to the coroners, it was the combination of the drugs, the fatal level drugs in his system, and the stress and underlying health issues that caused his death, which again, Derek Chauvin was essentially guilty of stressing him out, which triggered all those underlying issues, according to that analysis. And again, right, guilty by mob rule. That is what's happening. And this isn't old, folks. This is good old-fashioned Athenian democracy. You can actually watch some interviews we have coming out explaining this a bit more, right? The Athenian democratic system as opposed to the Roman Republican system. The Roman Republican system being closer to what the American system is built upon. And the Athenian democratic system being what was trying to be avoided by our leaders at the time of the Founding Fathers, because Athenian democracy was this. The mob decides justice. The moment, right? The emotions and opinions in the moment, the anger in the moment, the general atmosphere in the moment. The mob can get together and say this person is guilty because we say he's guilty and because we just don't like him, right? He's guilty because this harms our political interests. He's guilty because, if you're talking about this analogy of this train and it's heading in a direction and you have one rail line that has 3 people, another one that has 1 person, do you divert the train so it kills 1 person instead of 3, right? Does sacrificing 1 person to save the majority benefit the collective, right? Collective rule, mob rule. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe they believe that by finding, again, Derek Chauvin guilty, that they'll avoid riots, that they'll avoid protests, they'll avoid some violence in the streets. And so he's the, sacrificial lamb to protect us from the mob rule of, again, burning, looting, and murdering, which has defined the protests over the past year. Maybe that's part of it. Who knows, folks? But again, we're still waiting for the judge to come out with the final verdict, and we'll have to see how that goes. Now, that said, let's jump into some questions, and then I want to go into some other stories, including what Trump is talking about possibly running in 2024, saying he's very seriously considering it. A bit more, we're going to talk about what's happening with Mike Lindell's new platform, a few other stories as well. But again, first, folks, let's talk about some questions. Let's see here. This is from Rudy Naris. He said 2 questions. Where's Trump media? And what happened to Mike Lindell's Frank? So on both questions, Trump was talking about, and the family was talking about potentially releasing their own news outlet. We have not seen a Trump media or a Trump Times or anything like that just yet. Trump or his assistants, right, the people close to him are saying, right, they're saying that he's going to, sorry, MD, you're saying I'm lying about the fatal levels of trial testimony and toxicology reports that show no such thing. Actually, that's not true. The toxicology reports showed that he had very high levels of fentanyl and methamphetamine, and in addition to his health history, contributed to the death, which was exactly what the medical examiner found. So yes, they said, in fact, that the fentanyl, methamphetamine, and underlying health issues combined with stress is what killed him. And so I'm sorry, but they're saying in the actual reports released in the court that drugs did play a big role in killing him. And that is actually what was said in the trial based on the toxicology reports. And so, yes, that is what happened. Now, on that too, we're talking about Trump's media. There's been some talk about this. Trump was again talking about releasing his own media, and people close to Trump were saying that he's going to make his reappearance on the public stage once he releases his own social media. And again, we can assume that Trump would need a platform to make a public appearance once again, because right now he's mostly just doing statements. We'll have to see what happens with it. It's not clear right now whether Mike Lindell's new platform will be the one he uses or whether he'll create his own. Given that Trump is pretty close to Mike Lindell, there's a good chance that he might end up going with Mike Lindell's platform. And again, Mike Lindell's platform was supposed to be released on Monday, but they were under cyber attack, it seemed. He said they were under attack. And so we'll have to see what happens with it. Still waiting on the announcement to that. He had an all-day live broadcast yesterday. And see if we can get to some news on that. But really, Mike Lindell said the platform was under attack and wasn't able to launch it yesterday. Next question. This is Patriotism Save. And he said, at Joshua, what is the probability that Russia will attack Ukraine based on all of your knowledge of past offenses like Crimea, Georgia, etc.? I'd say very high right now. And, they're already talking about it. They're training their military, they're holding drills, and they're talking specifically about attacking Ukraine as a military defensive measure. You have Russia talking about invading Ukraine. You have Iran talking about starting a new conflict with Israel, saying the cyber attack on their nuclear facility amounts to nuclear attack on them. You have North Korea renewing threats, and you have the Chinese Communist Party talking about invading Taiwan. Now, if the Chinese Communist Party were to invade Taiwan, very likely they would want to encourage their allies to also hold similar invasions, right, to offset what they're doing. And the Chinese Communist Party, the Republic of Russia, and the Iranian regime do work pretty closely together. And so very likely if China were to invade Taiwan, we would very likely see also a Russian invasion of Ukraine again, taking Crimea at the very least. And also we could expect possibly even some actions on, under Iran again. Unclear whether Iran would dare attack Israel. Personally, I don't think that would be likely, especially given the peace agreements that Trump negotiated in the Middle East, and where you have Saudi Arabia being a lot more favorable to Israel as well. Very likely, if Iran were to launch an attack, it would be through terrorism, because the Quad military, the military of Iran tends to function also as a terrorist force, and so we can expect that to happen. We'll have to see. I think the probability is actually, unfortunately, very high right now that Russia may renew conflicts with Ukraine, and again, they're already talking about it. This is from CC. You said, could the forcing of mistrial be the bait to lead to civil unrest? It's possible. I mean, it's possible. You're asking again if the judge determines this was a mistrial based on, again, threats from public officials, and maybe the threats from public officials, Maxine Waters accused of making threats, could be interpreted as such, and the judge seemed to agree to an extent that he again mentioned it in court, and by mentioning it in court made the jury aware of it. It's possible, right? It's possible the judge could come out and say this was a mistrial, and by doing so, yes, because again the jury voted to convict him. The judge has not yet come out with it, and if the jury says one thing and the judge says something else, yeah, you're probably going to see riots. You're probably going to see chaos on the streets, and you're probably going to see also a lot of police officers either not want to enforce the law or resign because they're afraid of what this might mean for them. Really, folks, what's going to happen? Right? What's going to happen if you have riots on the streets, akin to what we had last year? But police no longer want to, let's say, enforce the law to stop them to do anything because a police officer was just sent to prison for, right, he could face up to 75 years and was charged on two counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. We'll have to see, right? Have to see what comes out from this. Robin Reinert, he said, hey, Josh, I'll catch the replay for sure. Isn't Waters inciting violence with her words/threats? Can she be impeached for inciting violence? Well, they did vote to censure her, but again, it was along party lines and they weren't able to do so. I mean, if Trump did that, they'd probably find a way to try to impeach him again. If Trump did that, they'd probably be calling for, blood on the streets and so on. They'd probably be saying all this, right? Whether they'll actually do something against Maxine Waters, I'd say very unlikely, because who's going to do it? The Senate and the House are both controlled by Democrats, and they're voting along party lines, and they're not going to go after Maxine Waters, to be honest. In fact, Nancy Pelosi is already coming to her defense, saying she doesn't have to apologize for what she did. Will judges do anything on it if it goes even to the Supreme Court? Based on the way the Supreme Court has been acting, they're more political these days as well. They probably won't do anything. Would Biden condemn her? No, I don't think so. Biden's doing the opposite, right? He's calling the family, and he said beforehand he hopes the jury makes the right decision, right? Quote unquote, right decision. This was a case determined to be the end of it before the information was even announced. Before things were even finalized, you had politicians weighing in on the way they were demanding it to end, essentially. That's what Maxine Waters was doing. Again, we'll have to see what comes out from it, but you're very unlikely to see anything done against Maxine Waters based on this. All right, folks. That says, moving to some other stories for the night, because there's some other stuff happening. And again, some actually interesting news as well. Trump making some statements again, talking about what his next steps are. And again, based on what we're seeing, right? Now, folks, Epoch Times reporting Trump is, quote, very seriously considering running for 2024. Epoch Times reports Trump very seriously considering 2024 run, and also plans to help GOP, the Republicans in 2022. Epoch Times reports this. It says, former President Donald Trump is focused on helping Republicans flip the House of Representatives in 2022, but is also mulling another presidential run 2 years later. And Trump said this: we are going to help with the House, right? Win back the House of Representatives. I think we have a really good chance. I'm working with everybody, including, he says, Kevin McCarthy, who is the House Republican leader, and taking back the House, he says. And he says, I think we have a really good chance. And Trump said this during an interview with Fox News' Sean Hannity that aired on late April 19th. Now, wrestling back control of the Senate will be harder, right? Because, well, it's the Senate. But Trump and his team plan to help with that as well. And Trump said this: if they need a rally, we'll do a rally. Saying again that Trump is going to be continuing doing these Trump rallies, specifically doing Trump rallies in support of different candidates, not just for the House, but also for the Senate. And again, folks, I've been saying for a while, we're about to watch this whole thing start up again. 2022 is not that far away. We're already in 2021 and pretty far into it. It's already the summer. The 2022 elections are right around the corner. And again, if Trump releases his own platform or uses Mike Lindell's platform, because they're going to need a way to organize, right? To organize protests, to organize rallies, to organize events, and also to give a platform for free speech that is being deleted by YouTube and other platforms. And again, remember that Trump's speech at CPAC, any YouTube channel that posted it not only had it deleted, but also received a strike from YouTube. Trump's videos cannot even be published sometimes on these platforms. And so once Trump releases his own platform or uses Mike Lindell's platform or another, we'll have to see what he chooses. We are very likely going to see him getting more engaged in the narrative battle. And again, you're going to be watching Trump rallies. He's talking about protests. He's talking about, again, community organizing and such. And we're going to watch, again, this whole thing begin to play out. Now, Trump says this, right? He said, again, if they need a rally, we'll do a rally. We'll do calls. We'll do all sorts of things. So even calls, right? He says, no, we're all in. And Trump says to hand it. He said, almost everybody I endorse wins. And he's taking credit for boosting Representative Julia Letlow in a recent race to succeed her husband, who died before he being sworn in. Candidates were told to run on Trump's Make America Great Again agenda. In other words, the candidates running under Trump's endorsement, right? The candidates running under Trump's endorsement are not going to be Republican establishment candidates, Bush-era types. These are going to be people supporting Trump's Make America Great Again agenda. In other words, this is not really about Republicans and Democrats anymore. Both parties have changed. Remember, folks, the Bush-era Republicans went to the Democrats, and most of the rhinos, as they called them, really left or switched sides during the Trump administration. What you're looking at now is a change in character among our political parties. The Democrat Party is more the establishment, right? And the Republican Party, under Trump's Make America Great Again agenda, is more like the Trump Party or the Make America Great Again Party, or more like a Patriot Party. This is what's going to be the basis of all the political debates until the elections in 2022, and then going from there as well into 2024. This is where things are at, right? Now, and again, Trump said they need to get behind his agenda if they want to win, fighting for things such as strong borders and border enforcement, lower taxes, etc. Now, as for 2024, talking about Trump running for re-election, Trump said he still hasn't made a final decision, but he did say this, strongly suggesting he's going to do it. And he said, quote, "I say this, I am looking at it very seriously, beyond seriously," right? And he said also, from a legal standpoint, I don't want to really talk about it yet. It's a little too soon. And so Trump's again deeply suggesting he's going to run for president again in 2024, but just not saying it openly. And he's not confirming it openly. But again, he's saying, I'm looking at it very, very seriously, quote, beyond seriously. But he's saying from a legal standpoint, he doesn't want to talk about it just yet. We'll have to see what happens. I'll keep you updated on that. Now, folks, as we talk about the death of George Floyd, we talk about what's happening with Derek Chauvin. Everyone remember the story about the Capitol police officer who was beaten to death by Trump supporters with a fire extinguisher on January 6th? Turns out the media lied to all of you. Turns out that whole narrative was fake. It turns out the narrative that was used, that the protesters killed this police officer, the entire thing was false. And again, folks, here's the story. Here's the real story coming out now. Big Times reports. Capitol Police Officer Sicknick died of natural causes from strokes after Capitol breach, according to a medical examiner. And it says here now, Epic Times reports, maybe this is why they didn't want to tell us the final verdict of what killed him. Maybe this is why they were hiding the medical reports from the public, because public officials were politicizing this. Public officials were using this, and the mainstream media was lying about it, suggesting again that violence erupted on January 6th and Trump supporters killed this police officer, right? Killed this Capitol police officer. The whole thing was fake. Everybody who died there was killed by the people deployed to deal with the issue. Killed again by the stress from the situation, much like George Floyd is being killed again by underlying health issues, drugs caused, and then triggered by the stress of the situation with the officer. Same situation. People died of heart attacks. People died of other issues, medical issues, because of the stress of the situation. Is anyone going to be charged in that? So far, nothing. And of course, Ashley Babbitt, shot by one of the Capitol police officers or guards on the site. No word about that. In fact, the individual who shot her, being unarmed, right, and again with several armed police officers right next to her, nothing on that, right? The different interpretations of justice being meted out right now. But Epoch Times reports this about what happened to the officer Sicknick. It says this: U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick suffered 2 strokes and died of natural causes. Natural causes. A day after the January 6th Capitol breach, the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office confirmed on April 19th, ending speculation that he was beaten to death by Trump supporters. Again, disinformation promoted not only by the mainstream media, but even by politicians. Now, Sicknick's January 7th death was natural, caused by strokes, according to Francisco J. Diaz, chief medical examiner for Washington. Now, remember, folks, they tried to impeach Trump over this. In fact, they even presented fake information about this, now that we know the truth of it, during the impeachment trials. They used fake news, disinformation, to impeach Trump during his last days in office. Again, they were using this, politicizing it, lying to you, while at the same time hiding the facts of the medical examiner's conclusion. Now, Diaz's office said in a timeline that Sicknick was sprayed with a chemical substance outside the U.S. Capitol at approximately 2:20 p.m. on January 6th. He collapsed at the Capitol at 10 p.m. and was taken to a local hospital. Sicknick died at 9:30 p.m. the next day. Diaz told the Washington Post that Sicknick did not suffer from an allergic reaction after being sprayed with chemical irritants as he engaged with the crowd at the Capitol. The examiner said he found no evidence of internal or external injuries. No internal injuries, no external injuries. He was not harmed in any physical way. But he added that all that transpired played a role in his condition. Diaz didn't elaborate, citing privacy laws. Now, 2 men are accused of assaulting Sicknick by spraying a chemical irritant, possibly bear spray, during the Capitol breach. But Diaz told the paper there's no evidence suggesting Sicknick suffered an allergic reaction, saying that such a reaction would have caused the officer's throat to close. And so, folks, you've been lied to about what happened at the Capitol. You were lied to about the context of Trump being impeached. You were lied to about the narratives being pushed to justify the surrounding of the U.S. Capitol with, again, barbed wire fences and thousands upon thousands of National Guard's troops. You were lied to. The information is now being made public. And again, the basis of this was the evidence on this was being withheld from the public even when they had the information on it. Why were they withholding this information from the public? Why were they preventing this information from being released until now, right? Why was this not being told to the public? And again, why are the people who are pushing the false narratives not being held accountable? If a lot of people publish disinformation or fake news, what normally happens if media publishes it, you have the quote-unquote fact checkers on different social media fact check them and then publish their fact checks, right? Which then goes and censors all the articles on it, and then YouTube or Facebook or whatever can then lower the spread or restrict the views on the different posts that were on it. Are the mainstream news outlets, including New York Times, that reported these fake stories, going to be held to that standard, right? Are the different politicians who who were lied to the public about this going to be censured for it? Very unlikely not. Will Trump do anything based on, again, having been impeached by really a rule of political officials, because it was, again, in the House and Senate that he was charged, and they went after him with the attempt to impeach him, right? It was a political trial. He was not taking a trial in front of a jury or in front of a judge. It was in front of, again, the House and the Senate. Are the officials who presented false evidence on the case going to be held accountable for that? Probably not. And again, what's going to happen now that every individual who died, 5 individuals died during the January 6th breach, right? You again had Ashley Babbitt killed by one of the officers, when you had many officers right by her. And again, she was unarmed. Are the individuals who died of different health issues going to be, let's say, the officials held accountable for their use of force, for, again, using methods that led to their deaths? Probably not. Because, again, you have, politicized courts. You have politicized issues and selective prosecution based on the context of political interest. That's what's happening. Now, folks, I mentioned as well Mike Lindell's social network. Let's give an update on this because it was supposed to have launched by now. We're still waiting for it. Epoch Times reports this. It says Mike Lindell's new social media platform attacked after launch. And Epoch Times reports MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell launched a new social media platform called Frank on Monday morning. Frank is in frankly speaking, right? But users aren't yet able to set up profiles to interact on the platform. And Mike Lindell said this during a live stream. He said Frank was attacked. It's the biggest attack in history next to the election. And he said that it took place from, quote, on cyber attacks from all over the world. And folks, the live stream, Lindell made the remarks as he is holding a 48-hour live stream as a backup plan. The live stream had about 15 million views at around noon, increased to around 90 million at 10 p.m., according to Lindell, meaning that maybe 90 million people were waiting to get on Mike Lindell's platform. That'd be very big. If 90 million people were watching this and 90 million people are paying attention to Frank, Mike Lindell's new social media platform, if those people were to subscribe for accounts on Frank, this could very quickly be, the biggest social network there is, or at least one of the biggest. Now, Mike Lindell said that Frank, also known as Frank Speech, is described as a mix of YouTube and Twitter, noting that he's received death threats. People are threatening to kill him, according to Mike Lindell. He said he has his own server so that when the website goes operational, it won't be vulnerable to being shut down by third-party providers, like we saw happen with Parler, for example. And again, earlier this year, social media website Parler was effectively deplatformed by Amazon Web Services after they took it down, and after Google and Apple removed it from the respective app stores. And on that note, right as Frank is about to be released, what happens? Epoch Times reports this. Parler says it will return to Apple's App Store next week. Interesting timing, right? Interesting timing that Apple is going to reinstate the app for Parler right as a competitor is announced. Maybe they want to divide the audience. Maybe they don't want everyone going to Frank, and so they're letting Parler back on the App Store to divide the attention of it, right? Interesting timing at the very least. But Epoch Times reports this. It says Parler on Monday, right? They said on Monday that it plans to make a comeback on the Apple Store next week after Apple said it has approved several proposed changes that would lead to Parler's reinstatement. In other words, Parler had to agree to some standards, right? Parler had to agree to some standards with Apple in order to go back on it. And an interesting timing as well that they're only letting it on right as Mike Lindell's about to launch this major competitor to these other platforms. Interesting timing at the very least. Let's see what happens with it, folks. We'll keep you updated. And also, as this happens, something else big is happening. James O'Keefe, Project Veritas, is suing Twitter. I mentioned before he was going to do this. It's now happening. Epoch Times reports Project Veritas founder James O'Keefe filed a lawsuit on April 19th, alleging that Twitter had defamed him by claiming that he operated fake accounts on the platform. The lawsuit, filed in the Supreme Court of New York in Westchester County, claims that Twitter knowingly defamed O'Keefe in a statement the company issued explaining his permanent suspension from the platform. And O'Keefe said this. He said the false accusation that Mr. O'Keefe operated, quote, fake accounts, which is what they accused him of, is particularly damaging for Mr. O'Keefe because Mr. O'Keefe is a journalist. As such, his reputation for transparency and accurate reporting is fundamental to his profession. And Twitter permanently banned James O'Keefe on April 15th without advance notice or an explanation. Shortly after, the social media giant, Twitter, had disseminated a statement to journalists accusing James O'Keefe of operating, this is a quote, operating fake accounts, fake Twitter accounts. Twitter did not respond to a request for comment on this, though. Now, folks, as all this happens as well, one of the big concerns is what happens with the police. We're talking about the potential riots. We're talking about Derek Chauvin. potentially going to prison for up to maybe 75 years, 74, 75 years, we'll have to see, depending on what the judge determines to have happen with it. We're waiting for the potential of large-scale protests and or riots across the country. People are threatening to even bring weapons, which Facebook has been censoring those posts calling for that. And of course, you also have calls to defund the police and calls against the police. But as this happens, folks, actually some different parts of the U.S. are pushing back against that move. And in Oklahoma, let's talk about what's happening there. Epoch Times reports Oklahoma Supreme Court rules city violated its law in cutting the police budget. It says here the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled on April 13th that the Norman City Council violated the state's Open Meeting Act, or Sunshine Act, when it approved a budget that slashed $865,000 from police department funding in June last year, amid calls to defund the police, spurred by social justice advocates in response to the May death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The state's top court unanimously upheld a December ruling from the Cleveland County District Court that found cutting the sum from the police department's fiscal year 2021 budget violated the law, after the Norman Fraternal Order of Police filed a lawsuit against the city council. And so you do have, again, fraternal orders of police pushing back against the moves to defund the police and pushing back specifically against issues created by city councils. Now, in New York and in other places, you had this done as well. City councils have effectively been defunding the police. And folks, as we get ready for riots, possibly, you do have some places that have defunded the police. What's going to happen in places where you don't have police on the streets? Either they're going to have to send in National Guards, you can have minor police enforcement, because, again, they've been defunded. There might be fewer of them in some places. And also you're going to have police maybe wary about how they use force to stop violence or other issues from taking place, how they respond to calls, and what they do when they're concerned about their own safety. Not just dealing with a mob that is very angry, specifically at police, but also a politicized legal system and political system that would side, again, with mob rule, even when it comes to evidence presented, which may mean that they might have been innocent. This is where things are at, folks, and so we'll have to see what happens with it. Now, that said, I'll be keeping you updated on all of this as we go forward. We'll have to see what happens. But, folks, as always, I'll see you again on the next episode. Every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, I'll be doing these live Q&As. Also, please check out the interviews we've been publishing. And folks, again, I'll see you this coming Thursday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That said, folks, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.